Even though the Cold War wasn't always a military struggle, it was, for the most part, an ideological struggle. Um, the government, in waging this Cold War, still had to win over popular sentiment. So you saw in the post-war years national security agencies influencing what kinds of things are going into Hollywood films. And certainly you really saw a push to remove any kind of negative things that would be said about US history. The CIA and defense departments actually financed a lot of artistic movements like the New York School, Jackson Pollock, Museum of Modern Art, things that would kind of back up ideas of freedom in the United States. The great mobilizing concept was the idea of totalitarianism. And totalitarianism was something that was defined as an aggressive, ideologically driven state that sought to subdue all civilized society, and used the idea of socialized or socialism to compare to the Soviets, and also used it to undermine social programs, things that would have been a part of the New Deal. And so with this push to undermine social programs, you do see a bit of a backlash with the rise of this idea of human rights that combined Enlightenment ideas with World War II atrocities. German officials that were a part of Nazi Germany were put on trial and charged with crimes against humanity. The UN created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which provided language for defining freedom that specifically laid out civil and political liberties. But there were ambiguities here. There was, questions about who can enforce these things, who should be enforcing these things. The United States and the Soviet Union both refused to accept outside interference in their internal affairs or restraints on foreign policy. And so the idea of this kind of played an increasing role in world affairs. After the war, President Truman's first domestic task was to demobilize, right? Move us from a wartime economy back to a peacetime economy. We went from 10 million to 3 million men and women in our armed forces in 1 year. There was also a really high divorce rate following the war. And you have the passage of the GI Bill, which provided home mortgages, small businesses, college tuition to soldiers who had served in the war. You have all of these, 7 million men that are getting out of the armed forces, entering the labor force. You have women losing their jobs, and the government abolished wartime agencies regulating industry. So you have a lot of changes that are happening in those post-war years. And what Truman kind of pushed forward was this idea of a fair deal for the American people that was really focused on improving the safety net and our standard of living. Some of the things that were involved in improving our economic safety net and standard of living were things like increasing the minimum wage, passing national health insurance, expanding public housing, expanding Social Security, and providing more aid for education. You also see, if you remember from last week, U.S. unions in the United States increased terribly through World War II. Just so many people were joining unions because the government was so helpful with unions. So you see new labor militancy in the post-war years. In 1946, the AFL and CIO merged together and started Operation Dixie, which was a campaign to bring unionization to the South and dislodge conservatives from regional politics. In 1946, 5 million workers walked off the job. Truman himself was generally anti-strike, but in order to resolve strikes, he appointed a number of federal fact-finding boards to go in and try to resolve these strikes so that everybody would kind of be getting a little bit of what they wanted. The middle class in the United States at this period of time generally voted Republican in the midterms because of those labor strikes. And many workers who were kind of discouraged by Truman or disappointed in Truman just did not vote. And so for the first time since the 1920s, in 1946, the Republicans swept the Congress, and by and large, Operation Dixie failed. And Congress really turned against, Republican Congress turned against the Fair Deal. They cut taxes for the wealthy. They passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which cut back on union gains. They outlawed closed shops, banned sympathy strikes and boycotts, prevented competitive union membership. So there's really like a backlash to that union militancy that we see in those post-war years. But Truman did allow for unprecedented prominence in national affairs. From 1945 to 1951, 11 states established fair employment practice commissions and passed laws against discrimination. You also see a large coalition with the NAACP launching voter registration campaigns in the South. And you do start to see law enforcement agencies taking lynching seriously. And one really major thing that happens in the 1940s is the Brooklyn Dodgers added Jackie Robinson to their team. Jackie Robinson was the first African-American man to serve in the major leagues. And so you see this challenge to long-standing exclusion, and his success, Jackie Robinson's success, opened the door for the integration of baseball, because really up until this time you had white leagues and you had Negro leagues, and this really led to the demise of all of those Negro leagues. In October of 1947, Truman appointed a commission on civil rights that was going to call on the federal government to be responsible for abolishing segregation and ensuring equal treatment. In February of 1948, Truman presented an ambitious plan for a permanent civil rights commission, national laws against lynching, getting rid of poll taxes, providing equal access to jobs. Congress approved nothing. Remember that in those midterms, Republicans did not support any of Truman's progressive laws. In July of 1948, President Truman signed an executive order that desegregated the armed forces. This was specifically for the Korean War, and this was the first conflict that was fought by an integrated army since the American Revolution. All of these moves with civil rights, though, caused a separation of Southern Democrats who left the Democratic Party and formed the States' Rights Democrats. They nominated Strom Thurmond for the presidency and called for complete segregation. So basically they were doubling down on segregation. The left wing of Democrats left-wing Democrats were critics, formed the Progressive Party and nominated Henry Wallace, who was going to push for an expansion of social welfare programs, and attacked in the South when campaigning for different foreign policy. So in the 1948 election, the main opponent for Truman was Republican Thomas Dewey, the States' Rights Democrats, and the new Progressive Party were really less influential third-party candidates. But Thomas Dewey, in his campaigning, was really unwilling to commit to any kind of controversial issues. And Truman, on his part, ran a really aggressive campaign, attacked Republicans as a do-nothing Congress. He revived New Deal rhetoric. Strom Thurmond, who was the States' Rights Democrats, carried the South, got 4 states. The states' rights campaign kind of offered a preview of the political transformation of the South and them coming into the Republican Party. Henry Wallace had a pretty humiliating defeat, and Truman won re-election.